The pen slipped from my fingers, leaving a jagged ink trail across the finance proposal I was supposed to be reviewing. I tried to inhale, but my lungs felt like they had turned to stone, and the voices of my Bible study group began to fade into a hollow ring. One moment I was looking at a spreadsheet, feeling the familiar weight of the tithe or be cursed sermon from the previous Sunday, and the next, the floor rushed up to meet me. Everything went black. For 7 minutes, I was gone. My name is Gwen. I'm 44 years old, a woman who has spent her life analyzing numbers and trying to build a career in finance, but none of my professional expertise could prepare me for what happened when my heart stopped on April 9. I didn't wake up in a hospital. I woke up in the presence of a light so pure it made the sun look like a flickering candle. And then I saw him. The transition wasn't a tunnel or a hallway. It was like waking up from a very long, very exhausting dream into a reality that made my old life look like a shadow. I felt a lightness in my chest that I hadn't felt since I was a child. All the pressure of my job, the deadlines, the complex interest rates, and the constant fear of not having enough simply evaporated. I was standing in a place that felt like a garden, but the colors were different. They were alive, humming with a sort of music I could feel in my bones. And then I saw him standing by a stream that looked like liquid diamonds. When our eyes met, I didn't see a stern judge or a distant deity. I saw someone who knew every thought I'd ever had, every secret shame and every midnight worry, and he loved me more because of them, not in spite of them. I collapsed. Not out of terror, but because the sheer weight of his kindness was too much for my human heart to hold. I started babbling. I remember trying to explain my bank accounts to him, trying to tell him why I had missed the building fund donation, why I had spent money on a new car instead of giving it to the missions trip. I was so caught up in the rules I'd been taught that I thought I had to audit my soul for him right then and there. Jesus reached out, and the moment his hand touched mine, the babbling stopped. A peace that defies every logical explanation flooded my mind. He didn't look at my clothes or my status. He looked at me. "Gwen," he said, and the way he said my name made me feel like I was the only person in the universe. "You have spent so much time counting, but you have forgotten how to breathe. You have been taught that my father is a debt collector, sitting behind a desk, waiting for his cut. But my father is a gardener. He doesn't want your taxes, he wants your growth." He took my hand, and the scenery around us began to shift, like the pages of a book turning in the wind. We were suddenly standing in the back of a small, dusty church I hadn't thought about in 30 years. I saw myself as a little girl, maybe 7 years old. I was watching my mother. She was crying silently as the velvet offering plate was passed down our row. I saw her hand trembling as she put in a crumpled $5 bill, money I knew she needed for the bus to get to her second job. I remembered the sermon that day. The pastor had shouted about how God wouldn't open the windows of heaven for thieves. Jesus stood beside me, watching the scene with a look of profound sadness. "Do you see her heart, Gwen?" he asked. I looked at my mother's face in the vision. She wasn't giving because she was happy. She was giving because she was terrified. She thought that if she kept that $5, God would let our heater break or let her lose her job. She was buying protection, not worshiping. "This is the lie that has traveled through your bloodline," Jesus said gently. "The idea that my love is something you purchase with a percentage. Look at what happens when fear drives the hand." He waved his hand, and I saw the fruit of that gift. I saw my mother walking home in the rain because she couldn't afford the bus. I saw her bitterness growing every time a bill came in the mail. I saw how she began to view God as a harsh landlord rather than a father. The vision shifted again. Now we were in a high-rise office building. It was my own office. I saw myself sitting there, just months ago, staring at a finance proposal for a new tech startup. I was successful, yes, but I was miserable. I saw myself writing a large check to my church, but as I signed my name, my heart was cold. I was doing it because the tithing chart in the church lobby said I should be in the highest bracket of givers. I wanted the recognition. I wanted the pastor to know my name. I wanted to feel like I had paid my dues, so I could go back to my life without feeling guilty. Jesus looked at me, and I felt exposed, but not ashamed. "You were giving out of a sense of duty, Gwen. You were checking a box. But look over here." He pointed to a corner of the office. I saw my cleaning lady, a woman named Maria. In the vision, she was sitting in the break room, reading a letter from her family back home. They were struggling. I saw myself walk past her in the vision, my mind full of my 10% calculation, and I never even looked at her. I never asked if she was okay. You gave your money to a building that was already paid for, Jesus said softly. But you ignored the temple of the Holy Spirit sitting in your own office. You thought the rules were more important than the person. My Father doesn't need your money to build his kingdom. He uses your heart to heal his children. When you give because you have to, or because you want to look good, you miss the miracle. I started to cry, the tears feeling like cool water on my face. But they told us Malachi said we were robbing you, I whispered. Jesus smiled, and it was a smile full of such ancient wisdom it made my soul ache. People often use the word as a cage, Gwen. They take a verse and turn it into a lock, but the word is meant to be a key. Let me show you what that storehouse was really for. Suddenly, the modern office vanished. We were standing on a hillside in ancient Israel. The air smelled of roasting grain and sun-warmed earth. I saw people coming from all over the countryside. They weren't bringing paper money or digital transfers. They were bringing baskets of olives, jugs of thick wine, and bleeding lambs. They were laughing. It felt like a festival, not a funeral. I watched as the leaders gathered the food, but they didn't keep it in a private vault. I saw a group of children who had lost their parents being brought to the storehouse. They were given bread and honey. I saw an old man, a foreigner who had no land of his own, being given enough grain to last through the winter. The storehouse was a pantry for the poor. It was a communal chest of mercy. The crime in Malachi, Jesus explained as we walked through the bustling crowd, wasn't that the poor weren't giving enough. The crime was that the leaders were taking the tithes and using them for themselves while the widows starved. They were robbing my Father of his reputation for being a provider. They were making the storehouse empty for those who needed it most. When a church today demands money from someone who can't afford bread, just to pay for a bigger television screen or a fancy car, they are the ones repeating the sin of Malachi. They are the ones robbing me of the chance to show my people what true care looks like. He showed me a vision of a young man I'd seen many times at my current church. He was a college student, always sitting in the back, looking tired. In the vision, I saw him looking at the offering bucket with a look of pure shame. He had $3 in his pocket, his bus fare for the week. He felt like he couldn't even pray because he wasn't faithful with his tithing. I saw him get up and leave before the service was even over, feeling like a failure. Jesus' voice grew firm. Do you think I want that young man's bus fare? Do you think my Father's throne is made of the pennies of the poor? That shame he feels is not from me. It is a weight placed on him by men who have forgotten the weightier matters of the law, justice, mercy, and faith. I would rather he use that money to eat a meal and know that I love him than give it to a system that makes him feel like a stranger in my house. I felt the chains of 1,000 Sunday morning guilt trips finally snap. I thought of all the times I had looked at my own spreadsheets and felt like God was a predator, waiting for me to slip up so he could take away my blessings. I saw how that fear had bled into my work, making me a harsher boss, a more stressed negotiator, and a woman who was always counting everything. Gwen, Jesus said, his voice echoing through the vision of the ancient marketplace, I want you to see what happens when the heart is freed from the math of men. Look at this. He showed me a vision of a small house in a neighborhood I recognized. Inside, a woman was looking at her bank account. She had very little, but she felt a quiet, gentle tug on her heart. Not a loud, shouting command from a pulpit, but a soft whisper. She went to her pantry, gathered a bag of groceries, and walked across the street to a neighbor who had just lost his job. There was no tax receipt. There was no public announcement. But as she handed over the bag, I saw a golden light flare up between them. That, Jesus said, is the tithe of the heart. That is the giving that moves the heavens. It isn't about the amount. It is about the response to my spirit. When you give because you see a need and you love the person, you are participating in the life of the Father. That is where the blessing is found, not in the percentage, but in the participation. As the vision of the woman and the groceries faded, Jesus led me deeper into the garden. The ground beneath my feet felt like velvet, and every step I took seemed to release a fragrance that reminded me of every happy memory I'd ever had. I looked at him, my mind still trying to process the business side of all this. In my world, everything had a clear return on investment. You put $1 in, you expect a certain result. I had treated my faith like a high-interest savings account, believing that if I hit that 10% mark, God was contractually obligated to protect my assets. Jesus stopped and looked at me, reading my thoughts as if they were written in the air. "You are thinking like an accountant again, Gwen. You are looking for a formula. But my Father is not a machine. You cannot input coins and expect a blessing to be dispensed. Let me show you the danger of the formula." Suddenly, the garden vanished, and I was standing inside a large modern auditorium. The lights were dazzling, and the music was so loud I could feel it vibrating in my chest. On the stage, a man in an expensive suit was pacing back and forth, holding a microphone. He was shouting about seed money. He told the crowd that if they gave a specific amount, $1,000, God would wipe out their debt by the end of the month. He called it a spiritual law. I watched the faces in the crowd. I saw a middle-aged man in the third row take out his credit card. His hands were shaking. He was already drowning in debt, and he was using his last bit of credit to sow into this promise. He looked desperate, like a man jumping off a cliff, hoping to find wings on the way down. Jesus stood beside me, his face a mask of grief. "This is manipulation, Gwen. This man on the stage is using my name to sell a product. He is telling my children that they can bribe the creator of the universe. He is teaching them that their relationship with me is a transaction. Do you see the fruit of this?" The scene fast-forwarded. I saw that same man a month later. His debt hadn't vanished. In fact, it was worse because of the interest on the credit card he'd used for the seed. He was sitting in his car, crying, feeling like God had abandoned him. He felt like he didn't have enough faith, like he was a failure because the formula didn't work for him. "This is why the secrets have been hidden," Jesus said, his voice vibrating with a quiet power. "Because the truth sets people free. And free people are harder to control. When a church uses fear or the promise of wealth to extract money, they are not building my kingdom. They are building their own. They have turned my house of prayer into a marketplace once again." He touched my shoulder, and the auditorium dissolved. Now we were in a much older place. It was the temple in Jerusalem. I saw the massive stone walls and the ornate carvings. We were standing near the treasury, where people were dropping their offerings into large, trumpet-shaped containers. I saw wealthy men walking up, dressed in fine robes. They made a great show of their giving, pouring in large amounts of coins that made a loud clattering sound as they hit the bottom. People whispered in awe of their generosity. Then I saw her, the widow. She was small, her clothes were worn, and she moved as if she wanted to be invisible. She reached out and dropped 2 tiny copper coins into the chest. It made almost no sound at all. "Everyone thinks this story is about the amount," Jesus said. "They use it to tell people that if a poor widow gave everything, then you should give more. But look closer, Gwen. Look at her eyes." I looked at the woman's face. There was no fear there. There was no sense of paying a bill. She wasn't looking at the religious leaders or the crowd. She was looking toward the heavens. She gave those coins because she loved God, and she trusted Him to be her provider. She wasn't following a law. She was expressing a relationship. "I said she gave more than all the others," Jesus explained, "not because the temple needed her 2 coins, but because her heart was completely untangled from the love of money. She was free. The rich men were giving out of their surplus, but they were still slaves to their wealth. They gave to be seen, to stay in good standing with the law. Their giving was a performance. Hers was a prayer." The vision shifted again, and we were back in the ancient storehouse from before. But this time, I saw the religious leaders from Malachi's time. They were in a back room, away from the eyes of the public. They were dividing up the tithes. I watched as they took the best of the grain, the finest of the wine, and the fattest of the livestock for themselves. They were living in luxury, while the storehouse meant for the poor was being depleted. "This is the third secret I want you to understand fully," Jesus said. The curse mentioned in the book of Malachi was directed at these men, the ones who were supposed to be the stewards of my Father's mercy. They were the ones robbing God because they were stealing from the widow, the orphan, and the hungry. When a modern leader uses that verse to scare a single mother into giving money she needs for her children's shoes, they are repeating the very sin that brought the warning in the first place. He led me through a series of rapid visions. I saw a church board meeting where the members were arguing over whether to spend $50,000 on a new light show for the stage or to use it to fund a local shelter. The light show won. I saw a pastor's mansion with a fountain in the driveway, while a family in his congregation was being evicted because they couldn't make rent. The disconnect is where the robbery happens, Jesus said. My Father's heart is for the person, not the property. When the resources of the church are used to build monuments to men instead of feeding the sheep, the windows of heaven do not open for that. My spirit does not reside in a budget. I reside in the brokenhearted. I felt a deep sense of conviction. I thought about the times I'd sat in business meetings for my own church, looking at the numbers, focusing on the growth of the brand rather than the needs of the people. I had treated the church like a corporation. So what does it look like when it's done right? I asked. Jesus smiled, and suddenly the air was filled with the sound of laughter. We were in a small room, maybe a basement or a living room. There were about 20 people there. It was the early church, just years after Jesus had ascended. There were no pews, no professional sound systems, no fancy robes. They were eating a meal together. I watched a man stand up and hand a bag of silver to another man. I sold my extra field, he said. I heard your family was struggling since the harvest failed. Take this. Another woman brought out a stack of handmade coats and began handing them to the children in the room. There was no offering time. There was no talk of 10%. They were simply looking around the room, seeing what was needed, and meeting that need. It was a community of radical generosity. This is the fourth secret, Jesus said. Giving was always meant to be spirit-led. In this room, there is no law telling them what to do. There is only the Holy Spirit moving in their hearts. When you are in a relationship with me, I will show you where the good soil is. I will tell you when to give, and I will tell you how much. Sometimes it will be much more than a tithe. Sometimes it will be a different kind of sacrifice, but it will always be for the purpose of love. He showed me a vision of a businessman, someone very much like me. He was at a charity auction. He was about to write a massive check, mostly because he knew it would be tax deductible and it would look good in the local paper. But as he held the pen, he felt a sudden, sharp nudge in his spirit. He looked across the room and saw a woman who worked in the kitchen, her face etched with exhaustion. The businessman didn't write the big check for the auction. Instead, he made some inquiries. He found out the woman's son needed a specialized surgery that she couldn't afford. He paid for the surgery anonymously. He never got the tax break. He never got his name in the paper. But in the vision, I saw a light shining around him that was brighter than any earthly spotlight. That man followed the Spirit, Jesus said. He ignored the manipulation of the event and listened to the whisper of the Father. That is true biblical giving. It isn't a bill you pay to an institution. It is a gift you give to a brother or sister. The garden around us began to glow with an intensity that was almost too much to bear. I felt the secret settling into my soul, replacing the old, cold calculations I'd lived by for 44 years. I realized that my finance proposals and my spreadsheets were just tools. They weren't the goal. The goal was the heart. You have been a good steward of numbers, Gwen, Jesus said. His eyes locked onto mine. But now I am calling you to be a steward of grace. I want you to go back and look at your life not as a series of accounts to be balanced, but as a garden to be tended. Don't let anyone put that yoke of fear back on you. You are not under a curse. You are under a canopy of my love. He began to show me visions of my own future, moments where I would have the choice to follow the old rules or the new way of the Spirit. I saw myself at work, seeing people not just as employees or line items, but as children of God. I saw myself praying over my bank account, asking, Father, whose life can we change today? Instead of, how much do I owe the church? I felt a sense of excitement I hadn't felt in years. The business of being a Christian had become so heavy, but this was light. This was joyful. I realized that the secrets weren't complex at all. They were simple. They were about love, about trust, and about listening to the quiet voice that knows exactly what the world needs. The garden around us seemed to expand, stretching out until the horizon was nothing but a sea of soft, golden light. Jesus began to walk again, and I followed him, feeling like a student who had finally grasped the most important lesson of her life. My mind, usually so cluttered with projections and profit margins, was remarkably still. I realized that my entire career had been built on the idea of scarcity, that there is only so much to go around, and you have to fight to keep your share. But here, in this place, the very air tasted like abundance. He stopped beside a tree whose leaves shimmered like silver. He didn't speak immediately. He let me look at a new vision that was forming in the space between the branches. I saw a large, prestigious university. In a quiet office, an elderly professor was looking at his retirement fund. He had more than enough. He was a devout man who had given his 10% to his denomination every single month for 40 years. He felt proud of his record, but then the vision shifted. I saw a young student in one of his classes, a brilliant girl who was about to drop out because she couldn't afford the final semester's tuition. She was praying in the library, her head bowed over a stack of books. Jesus looked at me. The professor is waiting for a plaque from his church for his lifetime of giving. He thinks his obligation is finished because he gave to the institution. But the Spirit is whispering to him about the girl in his classroom. He hears the whisper, but he ignores it because he thinks, I've already given my tithe to the storehouse. Do you see how the rule has become a wall? I nodded, the realization hitting me like a physical weight. He's using the tithe as an excuse not to be generous in the way you are asking him to be. Exactly, Jesus said. The law tells you that once you've given your 10%, the rest is yours to do with as you please. But the Spirit tells you that everything is mine, and I want to use it to bless my children. When you follow the Spirit, you might give 20% one month because a neighbor's house burned down. You might give 5% another month because you are the one who needs help. And that is okay. The freedom of the new covenant is not a license to be selfish. It is a license to be truly, wildly generous without the fear of breaking a rule. He showed me a vision of a small community center in a broken down part of a city. It wasn't a church, but the people there were acting like one. They were fixing bikes for kids, teaching people how to cook healthy meals on a budget, and providing a safe place for people to just sit and be seen. I saw a woman walk in and hand over a stack of envelopes. They were utility bills she had collected from the elderly people in the neighborhood. She had spent her tithe money to pay them directly. There was no sermon preached before she gave, Jesus whispered. There was no emotional music to pull at her heartstrings. She simply saw a need and she met it. She didn't ask for a receipt to show the world. She did it because she and I are friends, and she knows what makes me happy. When you give like this, you are not just fulfilling a religious duty. You are becoming a channel for the life of the Father to flow into the world. The vision changed again, becoming more personal. I saw myself, but I looked different. I was back in my office, but the tension in my shoulders was gone. A young man who worked for me was standing in the doorway, looking nervous. In the vision, he told me his mother was sick and he needed to take a week off, but he was afraid of losing his pay. I saw the old version of myself, the one who would have checked the employee handbook and cited the policy on unpaid leave. But then I saw the new version of myself. I saw myself tell him to take the time, and then I saw myself writing a personal check to cover his expenses so he wouldn't have to worry. That check, Jesus said, is a more beautiful offering than any amount you could put in a velvet plate to impress a congregation. That is the fourth secret in action. It is giving that is birthed from a relationship with me. It is not about a system. It is about a soul. He turned to me, his presence so overwhelming that I felt like I was melting into the light. Gwen, the world is tired of people who follow rules but have no love. They are tired of institutions that take and take, but never seem to have enough to help the person standing right outside their doors. I am sending you back to show them a different way. Show them that they are not servants of a counting house God. Show them that they are children of a king who owns the cattle on 1,000 hills and wants them to live in the joy of his generosity. I looked down at my hands, and for the first time, they didn't look like they were meant for grabbing or holding on tight. They looked like they were meant for opening. I felt a surge of strength, a sense of purpose that made my career in finance seem like a small, dusty room compared to the vastness of the kingdom. I understand now, I whispered. It's not about the money. It never was. It was about whether we trust you enough to let go of the things we think keep us safe. Jesus smiled, and the warmth of it felt like it could power 1,000 stars. You have learned well, my daughter. Do not forget the peace you feel here. Do not let the noise of the world or the demands of men drown out the whisper of my spirit. You are free. The light around us began to pulse, and I felt a gentle but persistent tugging at my chest. I knew my time in this place was coming to an end. I looked at Jesus one last time, wanting to memorize the look in his eyes, the look of a father who is infinitely proud of his child. He reached out and touched my forehead, and a final wave of peace washed over me, clearing away every last lingering doubt. Go now, he said, and remember, I am with you always, even to the end of the age. Your life is your offering. Make it a beautiful one. The garden began to blur, the vibrant colors bleeding into a soft, hazy white. I felt myself falling, but it wasn't a scary fall. It was like being tucked into a warm bed. The music of the garden faded, replaced by a rhythmic, mechanical thumping, the sound of a heart starting to beat again. It has been 9 days since I died. Today is April 18, 2026, and I am a different woman. I still look at finance proposals, but I don't see numbers anymore. I see opportunities to be the hands and feet of the man I met in the light. I don't give because I'm afraid of being cursed. I give because I'm loved, and because I've seen the beauty of a kingdom where no one is left behind. You are free, just as I am. You don't have to be afraid anymore. He just wants your heart.